Welcome to Stay Sharp with Razor Leaf, your secret weapon for all things digital in products and manufacturing. In this episode of Stay Sharp, Jonathan Scott and I sat down with DevOps expert Stephen Binstock to explore its definition, the key components, and its enterprise impact. We discussed requirements definition, functionality tracing, test execution, and the role of repositories in maintaining traceability. Stephen highlighted the shift to collaborative platforms, common challenges, and shared practical advice for those adopting DevOps. He emphasized automation, incremental benefits, and an open-minded approach. Let's tune in.
Welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp, the podcast about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. And I'm here with my co-host, Julianne Grant, today. Hey, Julianne.
Hey, everybody.
And we have a special guest today with us, Stephen Binstock. Stephen is, I would say he's an expert at the topic we're talking about today, related to DevOps, but his background is in all things really PLM related, right? So Stephen's a solution architect and tech lead on our Eris team. I think he's worked with a couple other tools over his background as well, but been working at this for years, probably coming up on 10 years in the technology space, and was a graduate of Purdue. His background there was in computer graphics technology. That's what he got his degree in, with a concentration in virtual product integration and web development. So all things tech related. So Stephen, thanks for being here today to talk with us about this topic.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. So I mentioned saying when I was giving Stephen's background a second ago that I think of him as a DevOps expert, and I believe that's the case, especially in the context we're talking about here. So the idea in today's episode is we want to demystify that word a little bit, that mashup word, right? And get into it. What is it? And if you're starting to listen to the podcast and thinking, oh, maybe I better turn this off, this sounds more complicated than I want, don't. Right? This shouldn't be an intimidating topic. I think Stephen's going to help make it simple for us, make it understandable, put it in practical terms, and then talk about, what can it be? What should it be? What's the right level of it to have inside an organization when you're trying to deal with systems that manage your digital product data? So I think that's generally the topic we want to cover today. And I think, let's just dig right in. So let's start. I'm going to start with a question, Stephen. Let's talk about what DevOps is. What, from your perspective, what is it?
Sure. In the context of what we're talking about, DevOps can mean a process or maybe an associated platform to implement a process.
Okay.
DevOps is really about how do we manage the development and operations of an enterprise system in the scope of today's conversation.
The dev and the ops, right? Development and operations. Makes sense.
Put them
okay.
together.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. And there is a whole slew of topics that can go into the development and the operations of a system. In how I'm going to frame it today, the key components that I think will give a ton of utility to an organization are really built around requirements definition, the ability to trace functionality of a system back to requirements, and the test execution side of vetting the requirements against the capability that you see in the end system. So those are the three that I think we'll touch on more today.
Okay. All right. So yeah, just sort of restating what I heard there, right? So DevOps being development and operations smashed together, but there's three kind of major components that we want to think of in terms of those processes or capabilities. Capturing and managing the requirements, capturing and managing what the system does, and then capturing and managing the testing and connecting all of those pieces so that you kind of have that whole view of developing the system and operating the system.
Yep. And I think it's important to understand why those are relevant to managing a system that evolves over time.
Okay.
So in the grand scheme of systems today, it's common for there to be a production environment and maybe an additional two or singular system for QA or testing and a development environment. And the state of those two or three environments are not always going to mirror each other. And
Sure.
that's where some of those key topics that we talked about come into play down the road.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we've talked on the podcast in other episodes about some, things related to infrastructure and environments, right? And like you mentioned, with business systems like we're focusing on here, right? So we're not necessarily talking about like a CAD application, but systems like PLM or MES or ERP or things that multiple people share. It's kind of an enterprise system or at least departmental or maybe cross-departmental system. You want to have multiple environments for purposes, like you mentioned, developing new capabilities, testing those out. We've even talked in the past about other ones like training, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there might be other special purpose systems, but the point being, they all aren't exact copies of each other. And that's where you're getting to with DevOps, right? Is you need to think about what state they're in and those kinds of things. So keep going.
Sure. So let's say that at a given point in time, we maybe just rolled out our first version of a business enterprise system like a PLM or an ERP. The thought is all three, I'm going to use three environments in this scenario as we move forward. The dev environment, the test environment, and the production environment are all replicas of one another. However, there are new features and maybe bug fixes that need to be addressed. And that process of managing the new features or the bug fixes will be introduced not at the same time across all three environments. They will be, created in one, vetted in another, and then ultimately deployed for end user utilization at a different point in time. So that implementation lifecycle is where DevOps starts to really get itself into view here.
Right, that's kind of the operations part, right? Like you said, all right, I've got a fix or I got a new little feature tweak, whatever. I got to build it, make sure it's right, and then I've got to put it in an environment where people can check it. And all of that is a process unto itself of getting it out to production. And it's something you need to manage, or what?
Yeah, or you're going to run into, and this will pop its head up again in the future, but you'll run into scenarios where maybe system behavior differs unexpectedly across those three environments. So in the sample scenario I was leaning into, I developed a new, login page in my dev environment. It's not out in production yet, but if I don't have a way to vet that the requirements in each of the systems can be validated accordingly, then it's a lot of digging up past email chains and locating local copies of files and that whole slew of problems.
Yeah, wasted work effectively, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what's interesting to me is as I'm listening, because I'm not in the DevOps world all that much, but it seems like these are things that we've done all along. Is it just a new way that we're framing it under this language of DevOps, or what am I hearing?
I think technology drives a lot of this. So in a maybe early into PLM implementations performed at Razorleaf, maybe before even my time with the company, the technology may have not been as robust as it is today, where we had to track requirements external to a platform like a spreadsheet.
Okay.
And now the technology really tries to tie all of the life cycle, the development portion of the life cycle, as well as the operations, into a single system where traceability is now further enhanced, is how I might take a guess at it in that fashion.
Yeah, and I could speak to that, right? Because I am old. But you're
Who said that? Nobody said that.
But you're right. I mean, it some of this stuff has been done for years, but not done well, not done in a connected way. Like Stephen mentioned, you might have a bunch of different spreadsheets, and you're having trouble correlating them across each other. And a process you might do, you stumbled across, like you found it as your own best practice, but it wasn't because somebody told you, hey, the principle here is this is what you should do. And I think, to Stephen's point, a lot of that now is finding its way into platforms and processes and tools that we can just pick up and use. So, Stephen, given that, I mean, if these environments can be out of sync, I mean, what do we need to keep them in sync, or why is it important, or what do we need to think about there with getting them back to being coordinated somehow?
Yeah, the first piece of synchronization in this case, again, the new feature that I just developed is in its prototype testing and maybe in the dev environment. It's not going to be ready for production until ways in the future, but I should be able to trace what the instance of that new feature looks like in the particular environment. And the easiest way that we've found with some of the new technology that comes with DevOps is what I'll refer to as repositories, or a mechanism in a DevOps platform to manage change control over the code or the configuration of a system.
Okay, let's stop there. I want to double click on that for a minute. So for those who aren't, IT people, maybe entirely familiar with this, let's take these off the shelf. There you go, Julianne. Let's take these off the shelf softwares like we're talking about, PLM, MES, that kind of thing. We know that a lot of them are configurable, but you can also customize and extend them. So to your point, Stephen, you might, if you want to know the configuration of that system that you've got deployed in test, like you said, you need to know exactly what version of which pieces of code are in play, where, and what configurations have been set, what switches were flipped in what ways. So you need to know all of that about that system, and that might be different than what you know about the other system, production or dev or whatnot. And this repository concept you're bringing up, that's where you would store those, whether they're text files, like the code might be in text files, or XML files or other file types, but you're version controlling them in this repo, right? That has all those, which tells you something about the configuration of that system in a certain state. That's what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay.
And I think it's easy to look at it in the inverse. If I didn't have a system that said this XML file looked, in this fashion at this point in time. So December 18th, I end up making a change to an XML file and it gets put into the development environment. Well, a lot of that can be communicated via email. Hey, I just made this. You can go test it, tomorrow. The problem is, after it's been tested, there's a gap between what the next evolution of that feature or change looks like. How long does it stay in just the development environment? So if we take a step back and think about what this really enables, the traceability that comes with a repository to manage our changes to our code base really allows us to say, in this point in time, I knew what was in my environment A, B, or C.
Right. Well, and that seems huge to me from the perspective of just troubleshooting, right? I'm thinking of a scenario that comes up all the time. I'll admit, in our business, we do get calls from customers sometimes. Hey, something's broken. Can you fix it? And our first question a lot of times is, well, what changed? And the answer you're talking about is exactly that, right? I mean, we know, I'll say 20 years ago, that was a common question. And a lot of times the answer was, oh, nothing changed, right? But the reason we got that answer is because the person didn't know what changed. There was no visibility into what state was it in on this date, what state is it on now, what's the difference between the two. And so just as something as simple as tracking that configuration, like you're saying, can make a huge difference in terms of troubleshooting and solving problems.
Yeah, and I don't want to make the emphasis of DevOps capabilities just around code management, because I think the other end of that question is what changed. Maybe a new requirement was introduced, right?
Yeah.
Which drove a code or configuration change to the repository. Now, if I take a step back, how am I, in a non-DevOps fashion, where am I documenting my system requirements? This new login menu that I asked for, that had to be written down somewhere. Is it a spreadsheet? Is it maybe it's a shared directory in SharePoint or something that doesn't have any interface to the code base itself? Really, where DevOps starts to shine is I can start to, through many of the common systems today, I can document my requirements in an aspect of the DevOps platform. And when a developer goes and works on that, the feature, the bug fix, their code can be linked to the requirement directly. And that provides a lot more traceability than some of these siloed approaches to tying requirements to the system behavior.
Yeah, and I can imagine if you end up with sort of a web of those things, that traceability is really handy, right? Where something broke. Okay, what broke? How is it supposed to work? And I'm guessing you're going to tell me that, well, that relates to the test part too, right? But something broke. What was it supposed to be doing? How does that relate to other things? What's the impact going to be to me? All those things, because you've got it connected.
Yep, that's a great time to pull in the third critical aspect of a DevOps platform, meaning the requirements definition, the repository or the code base, and this third aspect, which is the ability to document your testing procedure. So with those three, kind of the holy trinity of what I think is beneficial from a DevOps platform, I can say on this date, I introduced a requirement, and on a week later, here's the code that fulfilled that requirement, and did it meet the user's interaction with the system? I logged in using steps 1 through 5, and I got the expected result. Now, those three all play hand in hand with traceability and ensuring that the system is behaving up to expectation.
Closes the loop, right?
That's right.
Yeah, makes sense. So, all right, I feel pretty good that we've covered kind of what DevOps is, like the pieces, why those pieces are important and what we're trying to accomplish with it. Can you talk us through maybe some of the main processes, the things that people are doing day to day? How does it go end to end when you're using this tool in terms of using these systems, developing, deploying, whatever it might be? So how do they get used?
Sure. I think in the simplest fashion, it starts at the requirements level, meaning there is some record in, I worked in Microsoft's DevOps platform. There's a user story or a feature. That is the driver for how the system will behave in a future state. And that is usually drafted by a steering committee of who is, feeding in the direction that the system should take on.
Right.
If the requirement, so once that requirements definition has been completed in the platform, now a technical team member who has to implement to those requirements can say, okay, I'm going to pull down the existing code base if there is one. Say I'm adding a new feature. It was a user story that my manager wanted in the system, and I now go and write the code change, and commit is the formal language, but I make DevOps aware that I changed that piece of code in the repository. There's a linkage behind the scenes that says, on my user story or my feature that is being introduced, Stephen made a change to the software. And then from there, if no test plans exist, now would be a good time to introduce them. Right. The developer who wrote the tool or the feature says, okay, here's how your feature should be validated when you go to test it. And that's kind of the summarized version of how practical usage of the DevOps platform could come to be.
Kind of how you move through the steps, right, front to back. It's funny. It feels very meta to me that we're talking about that kind of process of configuration management of the system. And a lot of times we're talking about a PLM system, which is meant to help engineers do configuration management. It's like, wait a minute, we're in a circle here. But it makes sense, right? I mean, you could connect those two and say, well, this DevOps concept, I know we're talking about it in the context of these digital product systems that we work with and in the context of our podcast. But, at their core, I think we're talking about it's managing software development, right? And software is part of products. So it's logical that these things are connected.
Yeah.
So that process makes sense, right? Moving from requirements through to the configuration or coding and into the testing, that's sort of standard thing. What else? Are there other processes or pieces of processes that people are using the tools for that we should talk through?
I think the tools, so I will say they're, again, of the holy trinity that I referred to, the requirements, the configuration code base, and the test plans, there's a fourth one that is becoming popular in the industry, which is automating or automated integration or deployment of the code, right?
Okay.
That is not a requirement to just hop into DevOps if you're not using a tool like that today. That's kind of what I call the advanced next step. Once you've kind of gotten your feet wet with DevOps as a platform and a process, you can look to saying, oh, my feature in the development environment was tested according to my test plan. Now it needs to get moved to the next environment, right? So we're not going to talk a lot about automation today, although it is another benefit to a tool like a DevOps platform. But I do think that there is some tricks to implementing a DevOps platform if you're not working within one. And where that comes is because a lot of these processes exist, but not all in one environment, so to speak. I define my requirements today. Those either come within emails that get signed off on, or they get tracked in a shared Excel spreadsheet. But there is no, tie into seeing what the status of that looks like day in and day out. So many DevOps platforms will allow somebody to say, I wrote my user story or my feature, and there's a status associated with it. It's new, or it's in design, or it's awaiting testing. This is just another example of how the traceability becomes enhanced through a platform like this. But that shift from spreadsheets and emails to getting your team to take advantage of an online platform where everybody's collaborating all at once, there's some organizational shift that comes with that, right? Everybody's kind of familiar with one mechanism or one process, and now you introduce potentially a new piece of software, and the process may look the same, it may look different, but fundamentally, you're still trying to work towards the same objectives along the life cycle.
But to your point, it's different for the people participating in it, right? And we've talked about this a number of times on the podcast in other episodes, right?
I was going to say, it sounds a lot like OCM conversations.
It does, and I think it is, right? It's the difference. I'll draw an analogy like to the PDM world from 20 years ago. An engineer works with CAD and he's got his files on his desktop computer and he keeps it all to himself until he's ready to share it with anybody. And then the next day you say, well, we've implemented a PDM. I want you to put all your files there. Everybody can see all your work as it's happening. What? No, people shouldn't look at that, right? It's a similar thing. Oh, I've got these requirements. I'm working on them. I'm thinking about them. I've got my own spreadsheet. I'll send them to you when I'm ready. Versus, no, they're going to go in the repository with everybody else, and their life cycle will tell you whether they're ready or not. But it's a different animal, and not everybody's sort of ready for it, used to it, et cetera. That's what you're talking about, right?
Exactly. The fact that an organization or a team, one of the connotations with DevOps is often new software. It's built for large groups or orgs or teams. I think the practice of using DevOps can be leveraged independent of team size. I have a story that I think, looking back on this story, it would have been great to know about DevOps practices.
Okay, yeah, let's hear it.
So, at university, at the end of my final year, there's what's known as a capstone project. And this comprises 4 developers who are working on building a website for an organization in the community. And, a 4-developer team who all attends class together, we see each other regularly. It feels like we have a process to stay connected and up to date on all the happenings that go into building this website. Well, what we forget is that everybody takes time to develop their feature. Nobody really is sitting down daily and talking about the requirements or what the vision of the product looks like. Everybody's kind of got niche tasks towards working towards that final goal, but there wasn't a lot of structure to making sure we're executing towards that goal, and identifying, potential roadblocks and all the stuff in the development world. So without DevOps platforms, we ran into several occasions where somebody worked on a feature and they tested it locally. It works. Go send us a zip or a flash drive, give us the flash drive that has the project on it and let's use it on our side. Well, because all of this is happening locally, file versions get out of sync, and maybe some misinterpreted requirements along the way. It just speaks to what the benefit DevOps would have provided me at that time, to make sure that the collaboration and the traceability was where it needed to be to stay on track throughout that process.
I think there's another one in there. Your story reminds me of some things I've seen in the PLM world where I can imagine DevOps would help with this, right? But it's the kind of unknown dependency, right? Like, oh yeah, person A is working on this thing, and it depends on the thing that person B is working on, but maybe they don't realize it, or they don't realize there's timing that's going to overlap, or whatever it might be. And it just leads to exactly that problem you were describing. If you can't see it, you can't keep it straight.
Yeah. Yep.
That makes sense. So, all right, did we leave out any like key processes we should talk about? I feel like we kind of covered the basics of what are you using it for? How's the flow of things in DevOps? Before we run out of time, and I am paying attention to time, Julianne, believe it or not.
I am too. I'm watching you.
I want to talk about what what kinds of problems are people running into that this is helping them solve, right? So for our listeners who are saying, all right, I got you. I'm a little smarter on what the topic is. I kind of see what it does. Okay, where am I running into it that I don't realize? What should I be thinking about to help solve problems that I'm seeing day in and day out? So what do you see there, Stephen?
Sure. There are two scenarios where I think I can identify it. If I take a step back and I'm trying to analyze whether I'm in this scenario, there's a common, maybe an industry common term that has been heard before. It works in production, but it doesn't work in test. If you've ever heard that phrase or you've said it to a colleague of yours, that's probably a time to consider, do you have an existing DevOps platform and process? And if you do, maybe there's a gap in how you're utilizing the process and the platform. And if you don't, that could signal an opportunity to look into a DevOps platform.
It's funny when you said it. I've heard the reverse. The way you said it, I suppose that could be true too, right? But yeah, like it works. I usually hear it works in test. I don't know why it doesn't work in prod, right?
Yeah, but a variation of it could be it works on my machine, right? That's another way to think about it.
Yeah. It works in X. I don't know why it doesn't work in Y, whatever it might be. Yeah, and okay, so that's a great one, right? If you've ever heard that, that could be a sign that you need something in this DevOps area. Okay.
The other scenario that I think is a telltale sign that DevOps would make an effort around business system implementation more collaborative or more traceable is kind of on the opposite end. We're not talking technical here. We're talking more of how do people in teams collaborate. And I think in the scenario that I'm about to convey, I've got two different teams. Maybe one of the teams is responsible for the web interface of the system that we're working on, and team B is working on the database schema, right? Two different portions of the system. And maybe both of those teams are in the same organization, or one team or two teams split those, two organizations split those teams. So you have org 1 and they do all the front end, and org 2 is doing all the back end. Okay. You can imagine where if not everybody has the mechanisms to make informed decisions, team 1 is going to update the web interface, but team 2 isn't aware that a change to the web interface no longer plays nicely with the database schema. So it's not just maybe environment A is not behaving the same as environment B. It could also be I have a breakdown in making sure that the necessary team members involved with progressing my system are aware of the other teams or individuals who are contributing to that system's development.
And I'm going to guess that could happen at any of those three areas of functionality you talked about, right? It could be a conflict in requirements, could be a conflict in, well, the requirements are clear, but a conflict in how it got implemented, right? The database team did something that was not expected by the web interface team, even though they both kind of met the requirement. And then maybe in testing also, right? Oh, well, I tested it this way. Well, but you didn't test it that way. So really any of those places, you could have that kind of issue.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that the the teams in particular, making sure this is where I think organizational change becomes imperative to DevOps adoption. If I have cross-functional teams and different stakeholders, really all of the different angles to a system that gets implemented for an organization, there's a lot of collaboration that isn't always explicitly needed, right? Or
Right.
It isn't the first type of problem to solve. We know we need a tool to capture our requirements and make sure everybody's on the same page. Well, that's great, but it's hard to sift through emails. If it would be better potentially if everybody could go into the same record in real time, see the screenshot of here's how it's going to look, here's the key stakeholders that it impacts, and everybody's reading the single source of truth, which is that requirement in a DevOps-like platform.
Makes sense.
I got a question. So if I'm a business leader and, I'm not into this level of detail every day, what are the things that they need to know, or what are the problems they might be seeing that are bubbling up at a different level that might be rooted into DevOps issues?
Sure. This is an interesting, you ask a good question because it comes up in how, as a leader, can I tell if there might be a DevOps opportunity for a system that we have. One of them is the ability to collaborate on requirements, right? Email is not getting it done. There's a lot of misinterpretation. Old requirements that got scratched are still somehow on our radar. So in general,
people arguing sounds like a symptom.
Right. Yeah. That to put it in plain words, there is a misunderstanding of what was agreed to. Fair. And that's where the requirements captured in a DevOps platform could alleviate some of those symptoms. Another thing, and this ties back to the differences in environment capabilities, but what happens if it is noticed consistently that it's difficult to diagnose problems when they arise in a given environment? Let's just say production. Maybe it's taking a week to understand what's going on. Like, I just put a new feature, or the business might not be aware that a new feature was put into the system, but that feature is now causing chaos for a different group of users in that system. If it's difficult to diagnose an issue each time a deployment takes place, that could be a signal to an organization to consider using a DevOps platform. And then the third angle that I think would describe why leaders of an organization who oversee a business system would have a need for DevOps is if their technical team expresses difficulty in deployment, right? In an agile world, everybody's looking, how do we go put our capabilities into play faster? And if your technical team tells you, hey, a deployment's going to take me the entire weekend, or maybe even up to 8 hours, like a full day, the system's going to be down, we got to deploy, and it takes a full day, there could be opportunity gained from DevOps. A lot of that could be associated with the automation that comes with it. But even before then, just collecting the files that need to get deployed, if that's all on local servers or different folders, the idea of just a central repository where the stuff that has been developed against our requirements is ready to go, it could be easier to maintain the code base and simplify deployments.
Makes sense. Those feel like all things that people could see, right, Julianne? I mean, that you'd say, I'm seeing this, what's the issue? And like you could trace it right back to what Stephen's talking about.
Absolutely.
So I want to get ready to wrap up, but I want to make sure I give you time, Stephen, to kind of offer advice to the audience on this. So let's say somebody's listening to this and they're like, all right, this all sounds good. It sounds interesting, good orientation, helps me out. All right, how do I get started? Where do I go from here? Like what would you tell somebody? A couple things they could think about to get going.
One thing there's probably a lot of platforms out there. I'm familiar with, Microsoft's DevOps or Jira. I'm sure there are other types of systems that fulfill a DevOps gap. I will say a lot of these systems have an abundance of information that is available publicly. So if you're curious about, hey, I know that we could be doing requirements definition better, and you want to learn what that looks like in a different platform than your current one, there is no shortage of information on the web. If you're looking to iterate on your existing process, maybe you do have DevOps, but it's not working out. You're not seeing the benefits you expected to get from it. I think this is where the organizational change piece comes into play. Maybe it's a good opportunity to say, in the past, here is how we effectively managed our requirements. We wanted to move that process into a DevOps platform. Did we miss anything, or maybe we took the wrong approach? I think it can go both ways. You're a new adopter of DevOps because you see opportunity in streamlining, increasing transparency and collaboration, or you've adopted or partially adopted, and now you're looking for, I'm not realizing the benefits that I really thought I was going to get from that platform. Let's take a step back, and it becomes an organizational business challenge to reevaluate.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, Stephen. So, from there, that, sort of advice and thoughts for people, I want to jump into our wrap up, right? I'm sure we're getting short on time, and I think you've covered a lot of important ground today. So just to summarize what I heard, first off, we talked about what DevOps is, right? So development and operations smashed together, but what does that mean? It's about managing that process in the context we're talking about here today of the kind of business systems we work with in the digital engineering space. It's about preparing those systems, getting them ready, and then putting them in place and managing them as they run and as you improve and change them. So, but what are people doing in it? And practically, you kind of laid out for us those three main areas and added that fourth, that like when you're ready to level up, the fourth one's there. But the three big areas being, all right, requirements, understanding what the system needs to do, system configuration, knowing what is the exact configuration of any particular environment, because you might have multiple environments you're managing over time in these things. And then the third being testing, validation of, is the system meeting the requirements? So connecting the dots on all three of these things, and that traceability across. That's really what these DevOps platforms are doing and the processes people are following. And of course, I think you hit very early on why it matters, right? There are a ton of problems that can crop up in projects and just in the running of these systems that these DevOps tools and DevOps processes can help solve, reducing confusion, reducing non-value added tasks, getting people on the same page, help them collaborate, that kind of thing. And it gave people a few thoughts on what could they do to get started, even if they don't have a DevOps tool, they don't, they're sort of starting from ground zero. You gave them a few things they could do to get going on this. So for me, that's what I heard today. I feel like that was a great sort of overview of the topic for people, anywhere along the spectrum. Maybe not for people who are experts, right? I mean, if you're hearing all this and you're like, yeah, I got it. Yeah, good for you.
I know I learned a lot. Good. It was great for me. It was excellent.
What did I forget though, Stephen? I mean, in that wrap up in that summary, what do you want to add that we should make sure people took away from this?
I want to encourage people to keep an open mind going into an adoption of a DevOps platform. I know we've focused on three areas. There is a fourth that I kind of hinted at, and there are many other features that are often associated with these platforms. They don't have to all be adopted at once. You can inch your way into incremental benefit from these types of platforms, and they are robust enough, more often than not, that you can merge it around your business process. So if maybe a description field doesn't quite get you all the metadata you need to capture a requirement, there's a lot of configuration that can go into these tools as well.
All right. Well, with that, Stephen, thank you for being here. Really appreciate you coming on and talking to folks about DevOps and kind of laying all this out for everybody. Really, really good sort of overview of what we're talking about in this area and how people could get started with it. So with that, I think that wraps up another fun episode for us. Really, though, it's a conversation. We appreciate our audience, you guys being in it. Come back to us with comments, with questions. If we get Stephen back in to talk about this topic more or dig into it or any other topic, please, what do you want to hear about? What questions do you have? What could he help us dig into? So with that, thank you, Stephen, for being here. Thank you to my co-host, Julianne. And we'll see you next time. Stay sharp.
Thank you for being here and listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the like button or subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform or our YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, please be part of the conversation. Leave us a comment on our post or send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We're looking for more topics for 2025, so be sure to share your opinion. Until next time, stay sharp.